The air inside the United Nations General Assembly Hall was thick, not with the sterile calm of diplomatic routine, but with tension that could almost be touched. Every head of state, every delegate, every journalist present knew that the speeches that day would not be ordinary. The conflict in Gaza had reached another crescendo, and the world was holding its breath. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, stood at the marble podium. His posture was defiant, his voice sharp, his words unwavering. Cameras zoomed in as he declared, "We will keep bombing Gaza. We will not stop until every threat is erased, until our security is absolute." The words echoed through the chamber, like a hammer striking iron. Some delegates applauded politely. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but most remained silent, staring at the man who had just doubled down in front of the world. Among them sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. Unlike others, he did not fidget or whisper. His eyes were locked on Netanyahu, his expression unreadable but his presence magnetic. It was as if he carried within him the voice of the voiceless, the unspoken fury of those who had suffered too long. For several minutes, silence followed Netanyahu's speech. Then, the president of the assembly announced that Captain Traoré had requested the floor. When Traoré rose, the room itself seemed to tilt. Cameras swiveled, pens hovered above notepads, and the chatter of simultaneous interpreters filled the air. He walked to the podium slowly, his military uniform stark against the polished wood and marble surroundings. Unlike Netanyahu, he did not begin with prepared notes. He simply stared into the crowd, then into the camera lens broadcasting live to millions around the world. His voice was steady but heavy with conviction. "If you continue bombing Gaza," he said, each syllable sharp as a blade, "then be ready for the consequences." The words cut the hall in half. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. It was not a threat shouted in anger, but a truth spoken with the calm certainty of a man who believed. Justice had already chosen its side. The silence broke with murmurs that swelled into gasps. Some delegates clapped in bursts of defiance, while others exchanged alarmed glances. Netanyahu shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the table. The American delegation looked visibly uncomfortable, while representatives from several African and Middle Eastern nations nodded slowly, as if those words had finally said what they had long been waiting to hear. Reporters scribbled furiously. Photographers snapped images that would flood the front pages within hours. Social media began to explode with clips of the moment. Captions ranging from "Traoré speaks truth" to "Power to." "Is this the spark of a new global order?" Behind the scenes, the UN corridors hummed with tension. Diplomats whispered urgently, some calling Traoré reckless, others calling him courageous. African delegates rallied around him, declaring that finally, someone had stood up against unchecked violence. Middle Eastern representatives expressed gratitude, saying his words carried the weight of a moral stance the world could no longer ignore. Yet Western officials scrambled to contain the narrative, briefing the press that Traoré's remarks were out of line and unhelpful. But the more they tried to downplay the moment, the more it spread. On the streets of Gaza, fragments of the speech reached people through radios and phones. A father in the rubble of his destroyed home whispered to his children, "Someone finally spoke for us." Across African capitals, crowds gathered to watch the replay on big screens, chanting Traoré's name alongside calls for justice. In European cities, protests swelled, carrying banners with the now iconic phrase, "Be ready for the consequences." It was no longer just a diplomatic exchange. It was a spark igniting conversations, movements, and dreams. For Netanyahu, the words were an insult, a challenge he refused to acknowledge publicly. His government issued statements reaffirming its military operations. But privately, aides admitted that the speech had shifted the global mood, isolating Israel in ways it had not anticipated. For Traoré, the speech marked a turning point. He became not just the leader of Burkina Faso but a symbolic voice of resistance, a figure who dared to confront a superpower at one of the highest stages of diplomacy. Media outlets replayed the moment endlessly, dissecting every gesture, every pause, every syllable. Commentators debated whether Traoré had overstepped or whether he had spoken the words that so many Leaders were too afraid to say. Hashtag spread across platforms. Hashtag truth to power. Hashtag Africa speaks. Hashtag stop the bombing. Documentary filmmakers rushed to plan reenactments. Artists painted murals of Traoré standing tall at the podium. The confrontation became not just a moment in time, but a symbol of moral courage. And yet, beyond the headlines and hashtags, the deeper question lingered. What did it mean to be ready for the consequences? Was it a warning of political isolation, of economic retaliation, of grassroots uprisings, or of something far more profound, the moral judgment of history itself? As the hall emptied that night, many delegates left with more questions than answers. But one thing was undeniable: silence had been broken. In a world where power often silenced justice, a young captain from Africa had stood before the nations and declared that justice would not stay silent any longer. That is the moment this cinematic reenactment seeks to capture. The clash not just of words, but of worlds. The echo of one man's defiance reverberating across continents, forcing us all to ask who gets to speak for justice, and who has the courage to listen.